Chawton House has a collection of over 4,500 early editions of works by women writers.
And many of those works contribute to what we now think of as the romantic tradition within literature. So then, how to answer the question, what is the most romantic work in our collection? Well, for me, there was one specific volume of poetry that immediately came to mind. This is Lyrical Tales by Mary Robinson, published in 1800. Now, its title immediately takes us back to 1798 and the publication of Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a work that is now seen as a landmark within the tradition of Romantic poetics. Now, this is no accident. Why Mary Robinson calls her volume this, and the ideology, imagery, and literary techniques contained within it are part of an active attempt for her to write herself into this new romantic tradition that was still emerging at the time of her writing.
As a woman writer, trying something new, this was a harder fight. And for a long time, her literary talent was overlooked within critical assessment of Romanticism.
So who was Mary Robinson? Well, our portrait of her is a good place to start. This is an artist's impression of Mary Robinson, and we see her in the costume for the role that made her famous, that of Perdita in The Winter's Tale, so famous actually that she was referred to by that name in the press.
Her great beauty and entanglement with the Prince Regent forced her into an increasingly scandalous and notorious public persona.
Even some of her closest friends would refuse to publicly associate with her. When her longtime correspondent and fellow women writer Jane Porter heard of her death at a dinner party, she shamefully writes in her diary that she denied all knowledge of her.
What we don't have are portraits of Mary Robinson in the other artistic role that defined her life, that of a writer. She published her first literary work to great acclaim at only 19 and was prolific, comfortable working across genres with 6 volumes of poetry, 2 plays, 8 very popular novels, and she also published translations, periodical essays, and feminist political tracts. And her reputation didn't stop romantic writers and radicals from corresponding with her.
She strategically and actively pursued intellectual relationships with romantic writers such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge and radicals like William Godwin. And these were relationships of equals and intellectual exchange.
Coleridge called her a woman of undoubted genius and particularly praised her ear for metre. "She overloads everything," he wrote, "but I never knew a human being with so full a mind. Bad, good, and indifferent, I grant you, but full and overflowing."
In Lyrical Tales, we see Robinson's poetry at its most experimental, but it was published within a time of great turbulence for her. In May of 1800, she was living in debtor's prison. By the autumn, she'd published this new experimental volume of poetry, and by December, she had died.
Only 2 literary figures came to her funeral, one of whom was William Godwin. As a material object, this volume of Lyrical Tales can act as a stand-in for Robinson's contribution to Romanticism. If we then consider its materiality, it's relatively humble in its physical form compared to the first work that launched Robinson's literary career, the poems by Mrs. Robinson. Compare the copies of these works in our collection. Poems was published by subscription, and the subscribers list shows the extent to which Robinson was favoured by royalty, the gentry, and great artists of the day. It cost 1 guinea in its standard boards versus 5 shillings for Lyrical Tales. The fact that Lyrical Tales was published in the final year of Robinson's life is a part of how it materialises her contribution to Romanticism.
I'm here in the graveyard of Chawton Church, and one material thing that Robinson repeatedly returns to is the gravestone.
In such a setting begins the first poem, All Alone.
Ah, wherefore by the churchyard side, poor little lorn one, dost thou stray? Thy wavy locks but thinly hide the tears that dim thy blue eyes' ray. And wherefore dost thou sigh and moan and weep that thou art left alone?
Thy naked feet are wounded sore with naked thorn that cross thy daily road. The winter winds around thee roar. The churchyard is thy bleak abode. Thy pillow now a cold gravestone, and there thou lov'st to grieve alone. The refrain that the boy is all alone concludes each stanza. But the gravestone also has a voice in this. Robinson writes that it proclaims that thou art left alone. It is variously a bed for his mother, his own pillow, and a cold, inanimate stone. And his mother alternates between sentimentally being described as sleeping and physically decaying. The boy in All Alone may be grieving by a simple stone, but to have a gravestone is itself a privilege not afforded to all of her characters. In the Lascar, a term used from the 17th century for a so-called East Indian sailor, the refugee in a foreign land of England falls from a tree to his death, discovered by strangers, and no mark is left behind. The murdered sailor in The Haunted Beach has only a sandy bed, and other sailors dying at sea are described as sunk in the yawning ocean. Robinson's most explicit and self-referential use of the gravestone as a site that both announces death but can also offer its own form of lyric poetry comes in The Old Singing Dame. In a fairy tale-like setting, the lord of the castle is enraged by the cheerful singing of the dame from her humble cot, sending her to prison and an early grave. Describing her burial, Robinson reveals the woman's name to be Mary, whilst her simple grave is attended only by waving primroses and bespangled twilight. The lord, himself driven mad by the screeching of owls and other Gothic horrors, is laid to rest in a tomb of rich marble, but, Robinson adds, no soft tear displaying, which o'ershadows the grave of the poor singing dame. The dame named Mary, it is easy to read this as autobiographical. With her own death coming so soon after Lyrical Tales was published, her life directly collides with her poetry. What then of her own gravestone?
She was buried in the graveyard of the Church of Old Windsor. Apparently the parish was nervous about having a celebrity's grave, and she was tucked in the corner under a larch tree. If Lyrical Tales was the final volume of poetry that she published, then her gravestone was her last word. There are 2 poems engraved on her vault, one written by her daughter, but one by Robinson herself, specifically for this purpose. She imagines the scene, an isolated spot, few mourners coming, no tears shed, and yet she is defiant in asserting her intellectual powers. She is rich in worth and learning store. Unlike the pointed anonymity of the most famous Romantic poet's epitaph, that of John Keats, "Here lies one whose name was writ on water," Robinson uses her vault to powerfully assert not only her identity, but also her poetic worth. She describes herself as though undervalued in her lifetime, as one who shall snatch a wreath beyond the grave. It is a defiant claim to her place in the canon of Romantic literature.